All right, we want to talk about the medieval church today. There's a split that will occur in the church, but today we're going to focus on the Western Church. But from the establishment of Constantinople in 330, there was a rift between Eastern and Western churches. This rift was somewhat theological, but mostly political and geographical. The theological differences were pretty basic. Most of the great thinkers of the early church were from North Africa or Asia Minor, people like Augustine or Origen of Alexandria or Athanasius of Alexandria. Most of the early councils were held in the East, like Nicaea or Constantinople. Eastern Christians were more concerned with intellectual matters regarding doctrine. They became bitterly divided over theological issues, sometimes pretty small ones. Western Christians were more practical. They were just concerned with simply surviving in a hostile world dominated by barbarians. Eastern Christians tend to focus more on Jesus' divinity, and Western ones more on his humanity. They split formally in the year 1054. We'll discuss more about that later. Now, because of its missionary zeal and basic attractiveness, Christianity became virtually the only religion in Western Europe by the medieval period. The Muslim thrust into Europe was stopped in 732, the Battle of Tours-Poitiers, by Charles Martel. In the chaos of Rome's collapse, the papacy was the only secure leadership in the church, and popes exercised secular power, worldly power. They became kingmakers. It was a custom for the Holy Roman emperors to be crowned by the pope. Naturally, this led to abuses. This started it's easy date to remember. Charlemagne was crowned the first Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in the year 800. In terms of moral leadership, the papacy reached its lowest point in 1309 to 1377. This is known as the Babylonian captivity of the church, or the Avignon captivity. This was a period of papal wealth, luxury, moral decline, and abuse. So medieval Christianity for the Western Church is sort of a bad news, good news sort of thing. Here's the bad news. From 1309 to 1377, 7 successive popes resided in Avignon, in France, in Provence, southern France, rather than in Rome. The situation arose from a conflict between the papacy and the French crown. Following the strife between Philip IV of France and Pope Boniface VIII, in the death of his successor Benedict XI, after only 8 months in office, a deadlocked conclave finally elected Clement V, a Frenchman, as the Pope in 1305. Clement declined to move to Rome, remained in France, and in 1309 moved his court to the papal enclave at Avignon, where it remained for the next 67 years. A total of 7 popes reigned at Avignon. All were French, and they increasingly fell under the influence of the French crown. Finally, on September 13, 1376, Gregory XI abandoned Avignon, moved his court back to Rome. Arrived there on January 17, 1377, and this officially ended the Avignon papacy. But the French cardinals declared Urban VI, who was elected as Gregory's successor, invalid, and started a line of Avignon popes that are now considered illegitimate. So we have popes in Rome, we have popes in Avignon. This is called the Western Schism. The Council of Pisa was called in 1409 to settle the issue, but instead elected a 3rd pope. So there were 3 popes. Finally, the Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418. They had a whole bunch of things they dealt with. They returned the papacy to 1 pope in Rome. The 14th century in general was a bad time for Europe. There were 3 great crises. There was a spiritual crisis, which was this problem with the church that I just described. There was a political crisis, which was the 100 Years' War, which pretty much mirrored this century and was a constant warfare between England and France. And the third was a demographic crisis, the Black Death, which killed a third to a half of, in the middle of the century, of the population. Now some of the good news. There were some really bright spots in medieval Christianity. The scholar Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest, if not the greatest thinkers the church ever produced, died in 1274. The 10th to the 14th centuries in Europe were a time of intense intellectual activity. There were universities starting and new learning. And by the late medieval period, there was enough peaceful contact between Christians and Muslims to allow Christians access to the lost works of Plato and Aristotle, which the Muslims had preserved. An issue concerning Christian thinkers was the relationship between faith and reason. To what degree were Christian beliefs received or communicated through Scripture and the church consistent with what people perceived as truth through the use of human reason? The most outstanding Christian scholar to address this was Thomas Aquinas. He was an Italian Dominican monk who devoted his entire life to study. His two most important works, he wrote two important works, and the best known of those is the Summa Theologica. It's a massive systemization of the Christian faith that became the standard core of Roman Catholic theology. Aquinas attempted more than anyone else to Christianize Aristotle. He concluded that both reason and revelation are necessary for Christian faith. Summa Theologica is the pinnacle of something called scholasticism, which was not so much an ism, an ideology, as a method of critical thought prevalent in the Middle Ages. It was a method of learning, and one could argue that the humanism of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution itself are linked to the rise of scholasticism. So revelation and reason. Some modern Christians have lost the understanding of the balance between those two, I think. So this great intellectual revival, lots of universities. The oldest is the University of Bologna in Italy. And there was also an increased rise of monasticism. Although the papacy was subject to corruption and the lesser clergy to a degree, Christian spirituality was vigorously reviving in areas other than church hierarchy. During the 12th and 13th centuries, these great universities arose, often from cathedral schools. And it is from this development that scholasticism arose. But the yearning for spirituality was particularly pronounced in monasticism. It was largely because of monks and nuns that Christian spirituality survived and thrived. They became the battlements of Western civilization. In Ireland particularly, they were the centers of larger communities of lay people, the only places of learning in a largely illiterate society. During the 12th century especially, many new monastic orders were created in a massive reinvigoration of spiritual activity and intellectual activity. There were really many renaissances, or proto-renaissances. One major influence was a new community in Cluny, France, that had a number of Cluniac imitators. It focused on elaborate liturgy and prayer, almost exclusively, leaving the work to servants and serfs so that spiritual and intellectual pursuits could occupy a monk's full time. Other new groups went in different directions. Cistercians, Gregorians, Carthusians returned to the rule of Benedict and combined manual work and prayer. The first two are Cenobitic, Cistercians and Gregorians living together. However, the Carthusians there's a Carthusian monk there in the white robe, lived very cloistered lives, coming together like in their own little hut, basically, coming together only for worship and occasional business meetings, a semi-eremitical life. These, by the way, are these on the lower left are Cistercians, I think, and I think those are Gregorians on the upper right. And these orders, of course, exist today. People flocked to this monastic life in the Middle Ages. In contrast to monks and nuns living cloistered lives, mendicant friars or brothers worked among the lay people. They wandered around teaching and helping. The Dominican order was instituted to teach and refute heresies. This was the preaching order. Appropriately, Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican. Franciscans were another mendicant order founded by St. Francis, the great spiritual Christian after whom the current Pope takes his name. Without property, they wandered about preaching love, living on charity for their very meager needs, not unlike Buddhist monks we'll learn about later. These mendicant Dominicans and Franciscans, who are still missionaries today, became a major feature of medieval Christianity. Now, medieval mysticism, direct experiences of the transcendent, flourished during the Middle Ages, renewing the spiritual heart of the church. Especially in cloistered settings, monks and nuns sat and contemplated the meaning of the scriptures for the soul, the Word. The Word of God was thought to be God himself. It's a mystery. And so contemplation of this Word is contemplation of God. Biblical stories of battles between heroes and enemies were interpreted as the struggle between the soul and one's more worldly desires. Beyond this sort of rational contemplation, some engaged in quiet, non-conceptual prayer, simply resting receptively in the presence of God. It's meditation, essentially. In 13th century Italy, there was the endearing figure of St. Francis of Assisi, we mentioned. He was the playboy son of a rich merchant, underwent a radical spiritual transformation. He fled the world to lead a life, fugamundi, to lead a life of simple poverty, caring for lepers and rebuilding dilapidated old churches. He did this latter because he had a vision of Jesus on the cross saying, "Repair my church." The simple life of penance and prayer was suffused with mystical joy, one of the hallmarks of St. Francis. 2 years before his death, Francis received the stigmata. First, I believe, known Christian mystic to do this is replicas on his own body of the crucifixion wounds of Jesus. This miracle was interpreted as a sign of the saint's union with Jesus by suffering, prayer, holiness, and love. 14th century Italy witnessed an unprecedented degradation among the clergy, and the papacy was preoccupied with church politics. But within this spiritual vacuum, lay people gathered around saintly individuals to soak up an atmosphere of genuine devotion. Francis was one. Another was Catherine of Siena, St. Catherine. So greatly was she admired, she actually gained the ear of Pope Gregory XI, and he was the last Avignon Pope. She was the one that convinced him to return to Rome. She was called the mother of thousands of souls, and people were said to be converted just by seeing her face.